Good morning. Welcome to United Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. We're glad that we can host this event this morning. So welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Teschner, the Executive Director of the Care Center, and I want to thank you all for coming here today. It goes without saying we are really pleased to have Alyssa Gaines, the National Youth Poet Laureate, here to share her great work with us. Woo! Before we get on to the fun part of listening to Alyssa, I just want to take a few moments to thank those who made this event happen today. First, I'd like to thank our partner in this celebration, Urban Word. The National Youth Poet Laureate Program is an initiative of Urban Word, a New York-based organization committed to elevating youth voices as leaders at the intersection of art and civic engagement. I'd also like to thank Reverend Winston and the staff at the United Congregational Church for providing us with this truly stunning space. And while you're listening to Alyssa, you might look up. The ceiling is amazing. The whole place is amazing. I want to thank Charlene Choi, our poetry program coordinator at the Care Center, and all the staff who helped out with the planning and the behind-the-scenes work to make this happen. Thanks to my daughter, Reverend Rita Powell, for transporting Alyssa from Cambridge to Holyoke this morning and back home to Harvard. And thanks to those who funded our poetry program at the Care Center, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Poetry Foundation, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. It looks like it might take a village to do a poetry reading. And of course, I want to thank you, Alyssa, for agreeing to come here. As many of you know, the Care Center is an education, cultural, and support program for young mothers in our community. Poetry is a cornerstone of the program design. Care Center women read, write, and study poetry throughout the year, and one of the features of this program is something we call the Paper City Readers and Writers Series. Today's event is part of that series. I've asked Sylvia Gover, the woman who launched the Care Center Poetry Program some 20 years ago, to introduce our esteemed guest. Sylvia?
I am honored to be here today to introduce U.S. Youth Poet Laureate Alyssa Gaines. I'd like to begin at the beginning. As she tells it, Alyssa wrote her first poem in the 3rd grade when her teacher invited the class to write a poem about a color. She chose to write about the color black. And with that, a fire was lit. This small seed of a story encapsulates much about the journey that Alyssa Gaines embarked on from that day. There was a teacher who asked a room full of children to write a poem. There was a student who said yes. And this young girl who was just beginning to see herself within and her culture within the bigger picture in relation to the perceptions of others chose to write about black. And her parents saw her passion and responded to it. They helped her to enter the spoken word events and to succeed there. All of these elements of invitation and support combined to set Alyssa Gaines on her journey. She writes about and in response to issues of culture, ancestry, identity, pain, grief, and healing, and joy. Her poetry has been featured in Scholastic's Best Teen Writing, the Indianapolis Recorder. She's been published by Teach for America. She's performed in theater. She was captain of her high school lacrosse team. She's publishing her first book of poetry, and she's in her first year of Harvard. And did I mention she's also the United States Youth Poet Laureate. Pretty good. But that title is not just an honor, it's also a job, and one that Alyssa is taking seriously. She has pledged to civically engage with my nation through poetry. Those are her words. And that statement positions Gaines within a lineage of poets who have used their art to empower change. In the words of Toni Morrison, there is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. We need poets in every generation, and perhaps now more than ever, to carry that torch. These days we're hearing a lot about the mental health crisis that young people are facing in response to all that is going on in our world, all the attacks on our humanity coming from so many different directions. And that's one true story, but Alyssa Gaines offers another. She models what can happen when we process and channel experience through poetry and claim our voices to say what is true. While I can't help comment on Alyssa's youth, I also want to comment on the maturity that can precede age. At a time when people with far more years than she has and who hold positions of power have refused to take life's invitation to grow and evolve, Alyssa writes and speaks of nuance, of listening to those who have different experiences. Those are the qualities that mark true maturity. But this level of engagement and excellence is surprising only when we underestimate and undervalue the potential of young people, and when we forget that the clear vision, mistakenly dismissed as idealism, of our own formerly young selves and the youth in our midst. So with this in mind, I want to remind, first and foremost, all of the young poets, specifically the young poets from the Care Center in the audience today, that you too are being seen, heard, honored, and magnified by today's event, by the fact that here in Holyoke, the Care Center has committed to nurturing the voices of young poets like the Care Center students and like Alyssa Gaines. So let's let the magic begin. I give you U.S. Poet Laureate, Alyssa Gaines.
Hi, I'm Alyssa, and I'm super excited to be here. A big part of the exciting things I get to do with my title is like workshops, talking to young people. That's one of my favorite pieces. In the literary sense, my background is in like slam poetry, spoken word poetry. But as far as civic engagement is concerned, a lot of my background has to do with like workshops and expanding fine arts access, and that's a big part of my platform as a Youth Poet Laureate. So events like this are super exciting for me. The host organization for Youth Poet Laureate in my city, where I'm from, which is Indianapolis, Indiana, is this organization called Voices Corps, and they do very similar things as the Care Center. They have like a day reporting program, and they're really like a host for people pushing for educational equity and trying to create that change in a very material way in Indianapolis. So it's something that I care very deeply about. I've been involved with, so I'm excited to be here. And I would encourage all the young poets in the room to look for like Youth Poet Laureate programs at the local level. That's my first title was Indianapolis Youth Poet Laureate. Then you compete for the regional, you compete for the national, but it's an exciting platform. You get to use your writing to serve your community, and it's something that I'm so glad to have been able to do in my life. It was never like something I expected to happen. When I first started writing, in the 3rd grade, to when I showed my parents that poem, to my first slam, my first spoken word event, I never thought of all the places that poetry would take me or all the things it would allow me to do. It kind of just happened, as I heard about competitions or slams or submitted my writing for more reviews. I was just kind of in that world of poetry when we brought Youth Poet Laureate to Indianapolis. And so it all worked out. When I got that first title in Indianapolis, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what to do. And my local mentor told me, look into this other Youth Poet Laureate. Her name was Amanda Gorman, and I was just looking at her as what she did when she was her regional Youth Poet Laureate. And then, as I got older, I'm going through these poetry spaces, I'm doing these, civic works in my community, in my school, and then all of a sudden Amanda Gorman's at the inauguration. And so it's just been crazy to see all the places that the poetry has taken young people. And it really excites me because it's something I'm passionate about. It's something that's taught me so much. And so I'm really excited to be here with you guys in this sense, sharing poems that are very important to me, poems that I really like. I do a lot of big, businesses will call or big conferences and I have to write poems for them, but this is an opportunity for me to kind of show who I am as an artist, and so I'm very excited about it. Like I said, I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, so I'm really excited to be in Western Mass. This is the closest I've been anywhere in Massachusetts that looks like home, so I'm very excited. One of my favorite poets, Janez Smith, he talks about being a poet of something. What is it like to be a poet of place, a poet of time, a poet of culture? And I think if I had to categorize myself, I love to write about origins and where I grew up, the impact of that geography and those cultures on who I am today. And so I'm excited to be here and to share some poems about who I am, what I like to write about. So I will start with this poem that I wrote recently. It's called The Fable of Fall Creek. I wrote it for a clean water initiative for the Hoosier Environmental Council in my home state. And I think this poem is a good introduction to the way I write, to what I like to write about, and my passions as not only a poet, but also as a community member and an activist. The Fall Creek was once something like a fable. To all those lucky enough to live near it, naming our middle schools, our winding roads, our little league-filled fields, but still forgotten as a hidden feature of this land, I almost forgot the Fall Creek was a real thing, where strung together dirt stories could stick like mud, where politics were fallen leaves on the banks that set the stage for storytelling of the days when every backyard led back to this place. If only you walked far enough and weren't afraid of the trees. If a writer is a historian in any way, at least let me memorialize this place to say that our muddy water is more than enough. But Fall Creeks don't have glittering names like lakes do. Fall Creeks don't drip transparently off the tongue. Fall Creeks upheld only through word and action every time you say its name. Unlike lakes, beating within themselves, Maxinkuckee or Wawasee rolling over in their own reflection, full with busy content and people dissolved for miles, swimming where only they can see themselves. Creeks are murky, and creeks are brown. Creeks go under bridges where it's dark and stretch through woods where houses make you play outside and leave the screen door closed for all those blessed enough to see their lives carried in them, for all those who forgive. Creeks cradle stories downstream and remind us of why we love the places we call home, and isn't that all we can ask of them? Has Fall Creek not earned its keep? Our water is all sacred and must be funded so that we can see our zip code, our city, our state and its reflection. Our love can not only be for the Indiana we don't need to keep beautiful, the Indiana that is privately funded and maintained and progressively postcard. We cannot uphold only the places we geotag. Anything anything unsuitable for a lake vacation, becoming only water under a bridge, mythicized and memorable in the way we remember how it runs. Our environment in this state is for farmers and for workers and for all those who name the creeks they live near, by keeping them alive in stories and in speech, by calling out a moniker and waiting for the water to appear. For every Hoosier with a story rooted in some feature of land, some cornfield or cataract or creek, We must keep our home state clean, honoring the places that we know, that hold our stories and carry our dreams. And then also, I think as a good follow-up for this poem that's about the land and the natural beauty of Indiana as a whole, based on this body of water on the east side of Indianapolis called Fall Creek. I want to also talk about the east side of Indianapolis. That's where I'm from. I think it's characterized by a lot of diversity, economically, racially, ethnically. But I think the east side of Indianapolis also has some unique issues. It's a very, Midwestern place. I think if you think of cities like St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, like Indianapolis has that same kind of energy. And I think on the east side you see, especially for me in my experience, there's these issues of gun violence that are very uniquely affecting young people on the east side. And so anyone who grew up in Lawrence Township, anyone who grew up in the same zip code as me, a couple boys who have been shot and killed before you graduate from high school, which is a crazy experience in and of itself. And I think a lot of my work, circles around creating spaces for grief in response to tragedies like this. But I think also you have to honor and hold space for the beauty and all the resilience that these experiences create within the people who are most affected. So this poem is called East Side Everywhere. There is an east side everywhere there is a corner store. Everywhere the pace moves like a slow and steady bass line shaking the concrete. Everywhere your corporal compass tells you you're there. I'm out east. There's an east side everywhere. There's Capri Suns out back in a cooler after all day shooting water guns with your cousins in front of Mama's house. And you've been eating nothing but flat pancakes with the craters and hard edges, big breakfast spreads with bacon and seasoning salt eggs, old annotated recipe books, flour bags and eyeballed measurements, microwave meals, homemade burgers, and you start to smell like grease. There's an east side where there's sunsets you see over and behind homes so pure as the sun pours itself onto the flat roofs like an egg cracked red and purple, and yolk runs down between the neighbors so that everybody's golden. There's an east side everywhere there's gold slugs you see glinting from inside another person's car. Everywhere there is a barbershop, there is a football game, or even a fight after. Everywhere there is a park or a parking lot or a field that smells like match after 5. Everywhere there are boys in BB Simmons belts fly as the ones in bigger cities than this and still trying to emulate their favorite rapper, managing to be more Baton Rouge than Baltimore. And east side everywhere there are whole parks and a broken mall, an old plaza with gated up windows and bulletproof chicken spots. There's an east side everywhere. There's black people in big houses, Fishers and Fish Fries and 46235 and Geist and Gardner Park and Grandma's, Porter Books and Bread and Post Road and people posted in music, in history, in struggle, in basketball. There's an east side everywhere. There is a Lil Boosie song they play at every party or two of them. Everywhere they listen to NBA Youngboy before there was 38 Baby. Everywhere there's a Jiggalate and hometown heroes who almost made it out. There's an east side everywhere. There's a bunch of country people. Everywhere there's a county and a cousin who's been there, an east side. Everywhere the black people talk different. In the divide between Hoosiers and Indianimals, where there's Indianapolis and Naptown, everywhere there's an east side, there is a girl. Black like me, with hair like me, there is a beauty supply and there is gel, a girl who talks with her hands and painted nails, lip syncs to rap songs on Snapchat, a girl who cries. There is a girl who gets lost, but always remembers the way home, the way that grease lies in clothes, the flash of lightning bug, a melody of grass and mud, a girl who prays. And like grace unsaid in her hands before a good meal, those smells of mammals and innocent laughter stuck in her hair. Anytime she gets lost, she remembers her way around a kitchen, and she's back to the east side. And the east side is everywhere. I also have this poem as well about kind of my family's history. It's called Blue Dashers. And this poem for me is very powerful because I think it represents, the way in which poetry can be used in all types of different ways. For me, I used this poem when I was doing research about the South because I do have family from the South. My dad's family is from Russellville, Kentucky. We took a trip to Branson, Missouri. And I think, there's a lot of people don't respect the Southern Black culture. And all the things we carry with with us as Black people that come from our Southern origins. And so I wanted to talk about this complexity of what it's like to be Black and be from the South, especially when everyone's conception of the South, or popular conception of the South now, would be that it's unfriendly to people of diverse backgrounds. And especially like living in Indiana, which is pretty Southern culturally, there's still people who say, like, if you go to the Deep South as a Black person, like, this is an unsafe experience. And so what does it mean to be Black and from the South? This poem is a villanelle, which is also a Southern style of poetry. And so it's called Blue Dashers. Blue dashers dancing atop the lake. Light strokes across the heavy landscape, eagles fly and bow riders call. I was baptized in the blue waters of a red state and came to south of the Mason-Dixon, and there I was, stagnant and Black against the holy water in the land stretching its fingers to God. Heard the sweet hymn of deep trees, the timber and hum of cicadas, closed my eyes and dreamt of how slow I could talk. I was baptized in the blue waters of a red state and came to south of the Mason-Dixon. Blue dashers dancing across the lake, light strokes atop the heavy landscape, eagles fly and bow riders call. Free as a crystal sparkling surface on fire, sweat running wild and sticking me to a flowy white dress, rosy like a doll, dipped in milk, drunk on honey, grasping at salt, but quiet and wishing. There I was, stagnant and Black against the holy water and the land stretching its fingers to God. Then, rising on the lake in my dress, born again, washed, resurrected and all, watching a flag fly off the back of the boat, reverent in its gall, I found an errant breath and heard a familiar whisper like God in the wind telling freedom stories in the tides of dreams past like prayer across kin. Blue dashers dancing atop the lake, light strokes across the heavy landscape, eagles fly and bow riders call, light breaking thick mountain forests to glimmer down, make this all gold. I watched in awe, every hair standing up, mouth open to the chill wind, and there I was, stagnant and Black against the holy water in the land stretching its fingers to God in Branson, Missouri, my world distilled into lake and slowed to the crawl of a white Chris craft in a southern drawl. I was baptized and born again to a new religion. Blue dashers dancing atop the lake, light strokes across the heavy landscape, eagles fly and bow riders call, and there I was, stagnant and Black against the holy water in the land stretching its fingers to God. But was it God or ghosts that made this promised land? Voices in the wind of my kin asking where I've been, wondering how long it would take me to reclaim the land promised to them, to jump unshackled in the lake and let them watch me sink or swim. And what if I drown in memory of all they were amongst chosen people, too proud and too taught to bleed red, and me still Black against the water and Black as the swing in the trees, and me trying hard to be blue like a dasher or water or sweet like honey golden light, Black as whatever breathes at the bottom of the basin and the undercurrent it came through, and wishing still to rise, to dance in the wind like the stars and the stripes from the back of the boat in flight, the first thing I saw when I finally opened my eyes. I also have some more traditional spoken word pieces to share. Like I said, my background is in slam poetry, which is a competitive form of poetry. I would go to these big international slams, and so you compete with a team representing your home state. And so we'd meet as a team, we'd write poems together, you'd have individual poems, and then you go up in these rounds and you get scored. And there's a lot of discussion now surrounding the problems with putting a number value on someone's poem, putting young people in slams, what does that do to their creative process, and all these things. But I think a good element of slam was the urgency it brought to the poetry. You were challenged to do things with poetry you'd never seen done before. You had a listening audience, you had judges, and so you kind of owed to these people a poem that was urgent in its subject matter and in its presentation. So I've been in slams where I see teams like separate the microphones, they get up there, they're flipping off of each other's backs. It's crazy the things you can see done with a poem at slam. But a lot of the poems are more current events, they're rooted in the political, they're rooted in like pop culture. So this is a poem I have about the importance of extracurricular access in schools and fine arts programming. You only have to learn to dance bachata once before its 4 steps become a doubly sacred practice, before you never forget that there is something shared between you and millions of others if only the right music is played. I learned to dance bachata in gym class, preparing with my friends for hypothetical quinceañeras to come, watching videos of complicated spins, synthesizing el estilo caribeño con lo mexicano anytime the teacher let us use the radio. I remember learning the difference between el teque teque and te extraño. My friends defining reggaeton as something they couldn't teach, putting footsteps to my favorite Prince Royce songs that taught me my first words, like madrinas, moving tables to the side on weekends, building salones de fiestas out of back rooms, teaching us to dance salsa, all in a line to Rebelión by Joe Arroyo, practicando pa los bailes sorpresas. In school, I learned Spanish like a catalyst, a language to locate middle ground between me and the girls next to me, dance, a way to honor the ancestry that we share, neutralizing our accents and talking in a way that still only we know. In school, I spoke para recordar que los niños cercanos de mí eran similar por lo menos en escuela, aunque afuera nuestras vidas eran distintas. At school, at least we learned to dance. In classrooms across the country, students are discovering language between them that only they know. Dreams of every color dance into school with them, buscando el piso, a floor upon which to flourish. Across the country, children put their backpacks on one strap at a time. If not for language or equity, they are equalized by whatever brings them in. Leaves are changing. As school bells ring, shoe soles leave stem spines cracked against the concrete and wonder quietly, what will grow before recess? Students are building bridges across hallways. In beats they bang out together on lunchroom tables. Entre los escritorios sí se encuentra comunidad, words engraved in desks, and emphasis on all language itself can share. A que onda slicing through cold, crisp air, a little laugh in the back of class, closing the space between each chair. This is where I first found hope. Outside of any lesson plan, I learned hope from holding my friends' hands, from stepping together in rhythm, to the way that each bell begat the potential for a brand new day, listening closely for that first tone and imagining a ritmo. Beyond wherever we first put our backpacks on, bailando en el gimnasio. And this is the community that schools should carry. An equitable space where holistic, culturally responsive learning can take place, where dreams can catch and carry like a whistle or a hum, where students can teach each other to dance, and where kids can laugh and move despite their battles and forces that tell them not to, where as long as there is a beat, as long as adults are listening and lifting up the voice, as long as there is space for a freestyle, a song, a talent show, a radio, the children will be all right. And I think poetry can be very public in that sense, and slam, spoken word, performing. But there's also this use for poetry that I love, and it's the personal poem. And it's healing in a very personal way. And so recently I was giving a workshop, and someone asked, if poetry is a tool for activism, do you ever write for yourself? Is there any activism or work that needs to be done on that personal level? And my answer was yes. And they asked me what's the most personal poem I've ever written, and it was this one that I'm going to share with you guys. I've never read this poem out loud before, but I think in talking about the power of writing for yourself, to heal yourself, to figure out complex experiences you've been through, there's also power in sharing that with other people who might share the same experiences. So this poem is called Screwed. It's a sestina, which means there's a couple words that are repeated throughout the poem at the end of lines, but the lines kind of reorganize themselves. There's also a meter requirement, so I think the lines have 10 syllables. And the poem in this way kind of complicates itself. It tangles itself up in its own language. And so this poem's called Screwed, a sestina for the feeling of wanting to shed all your skin, wash it, and flip it inside out before you ever wear it again, or whatever it's called when you must put yourself back on like a hide. I watched myself become a soft woman, screwed, and my ilium cracked like a wishbone. Hands meeting, rushing to grab the last piece of me like a rotting roadkill carcass, both our hands bloody and love red with game, measuring both our halves against the moon. How did I get here matched by this here moon? Look how my bones bend and make me woman screwed, blushing desperation, visibly game, and him holding my hand like a wishbone, and then cradling me like a carcass, and him cracking me into more pieces. I have always wanted to be pieces, to be a good girl as full as the moon, fragrant and soft, as a roadkill carcass watched how they all hold the rotting women screwed, hope in their steady hands like a wishbone, break them and mount them on the walls like game to be watched, and unassuming and game, used and consumed in all of my pieces to break, graceful and share like a wishbone and shine, dark and elegant as the moon, and then under that same moon made woman screwed to after lay done like someone's carcass. This is what she gets, a stink like carcass she always admired, paraded like game, her guts spilled out like a loose woman screwed, finally, too soft, too bloody pieces, crunched under teeth, smiling, white as the moon, sucked all the meat till she's only wishbone. Imagine its rough texture, this wishbone, protruding through her delicate carcass, parked here forever left under this moon caught. A deer in headlights, she is so game, scattering under this car her pieces, bleeding all over like a good woman screwed, a parking lot woman screwed, wishing I could break the moon in half like a wishbone, get the biggest of the pieces, and find a new living body, leave only a carcass behind in this backseat with her mouth open, blushing like game under a wolf howling up at the moon. Okay, so this next poem, I really like this one. I wrote this when I was younger, and it's also about like east side of Indianapolis, and also the experience of like reckoning with the death of someone you know, so at such a young age. It's called That One Park Where So-and-so Got Shot. I know that park. That one park where when I was little, we came across a dead bird beneath a tree on the park floor. Our childish eyes rushed to see what childish minds don't want to know, don't need to know yet. We stared in awe at the sleeping bird. With one wing twisted on the ground, the other tucked in tight, we wanted to flip it. You get a stick. No, you do it. Are you scared? I stuck a stick out in front of our classroom like semicircle, pointed at the bird with the pokey end, then turned it over. Lifeless and full of nothing, it bounced against the hard dirt pathway like a deflated ball. Its eye socket full of anything but an eye. We stared at the bird, and the bird stared back at us. All of his promise, hopes, and dreams in his dead eyes, we saw a lifeless future and remembered our own. Covered and caked on mud and dirt and dust, and it looked like it'd been there for some while, crushed beak, Caudal end flat on the ground, crooked leg and long white larva sliming around the empty eye socket. Ants marched up and down the body like a hill, and we all felt icky. The bird that had fallen in flight still turned like it was light and empty, and that was the worst part. We all, in our semicircle, locked our fingers like little crosses or a promise and said a prayer so that our hands could together be clean, so that the bird would find its way home, that we would never have to see something so nasty again. Before we knew death as well as each other and all the idols it made, before death was like the street name of each block and each movie theater and each park we used to play in, before we knew our stomping grounds to be so sacred, before we knew the difference between a gunshot and a backfiring car or a firework, this was the first taste, a dead black bird in the park with quiet eyes and dried, bloodied limbs, twisted and rotten. There was that haunting bird, and it scared us, and we prayed. For all the dreams the boy had abandoned, his unfulfilled hopes, we prayed because we knew the boy was gone forever. We prayed that he'd be at least somewhere better. But we knew that this destroyed boy would never come back. And that's what scared our young selves so much. We'd always been told not to grow up too fast. We had our whole lives ahead of us, and then suddenly we knew how little life we had. Suddenly we knew that we were sure of nothing. Suddenly we needed answers to questions we didn't even know how to ask yet. And then to conclude my readings for you all, this is a poem I wrote recently. It's called Remember. And it's kind of about, what does it look like to regenerate, to become new, to heal from certain traumas. And also it mentions cicadas. I don't know if they got bad in Western Massachusetts, but in Indianapolis we had cicadas like 2 summers ago, and it was so bad, like the branches of the trees would be covered in cicadas. I'd be inside my house, I could hear them outside. Like it was a big deal on the east side of Indianapolis. So here's a poem called Remember that kind of mentions that experience and also talks about the experience of living on these sites. And I wanted to also end on this note because I think it's a hopeful note to end on. And I think you can never tell a story of only damage. Sorry. Oh, no worries. Oh, it's okay, thank you. Okay, got it. But yeah, I think you can't tell a story of only damage. You can't tell a story of only gun violence or of only racism or of only X negative factor, because that's not all that the community is. And so I think it's also important to make space for joy and hope when you're talking about, a community of people. I remember cicadas, a wall of plague surrounding my side of town that summer. Cicadas, chucking themselves at outbound windshields, bushes shaking at every stranger, and me trembling back at them. I remember the fear, how safe me and all my loved ones really were that summer. I remember, more than ever, spirits, the 17-year-old cicadas, becoming, rising, loving, yelling, and dying. Imagine my 17 that summer, seeking to do exactly the same, and all of the boys I remembered who beat me to it. I recognized their screams outside all summer. I imagined the city heavy and full and vibrating with the yells of all the ones no longer there to witness their echo resound from the trees to and from each other. I imagined them, the boys and girls and grandparents, 17 and crawling up, back from the dirt, fluttering around for me to flinch, remembering my own jumping heartbeat, screaming at me as I remember how to scream back. Thank you all for having me here to read. I also would love to answer any questions, discuss kind of poetry as a young person, that kind of thing. So if anyone has any questions, I'm also here for that. Yeah. Blue dashes are a type of dragonfly. And so when I was in Missouri, they were everywhere. And they kind of like, the way they fly is they kind of like flutter over the lake. They like just graze it. And they kind of like hover over things. And so I think for me, when I was thinking about what does the South look like, what does it mean to be Black in the South, not only were there these images of like color, and like wildlife, the noise of cicadas and trees, and the dragonflies that fly around, and they're blue, they're bright blue, but also it's like the way that they just skim the water, and they never like break through into it. They can't swim, you know, but they're not flying through the sky either. They just kind of graze the water, and I thought that that was an interesting metaphor for the way in which Black people can interact with Southern culture, because Black Americans are a feature of Southern culture. We started in the United States, concentrated in high numbers in the South, but also there's this part that we can't quite break into. But we, you know, it doesn't mean that we have to leave. It means we have to figure out what that tension looks like. So I thought it was just an interesting metaphor for that. Yeah. Yeah, I talk a lot about music in my poetry because for me, it's a form of like communal art and communal healing. I have a poem called Lágrimas Negras where I talk about this bolero by the same name. And I think when you think about what brings people together across cultures, Black Americans across the diaspora, there are these musical traditions that you can recognize in English and Spanish that are very culturally significant. And I think it's a way to heal culturally and to make space for joy culturally. When you're singing together, when you're dancing together, whether you're singing with someone on the radio or you're singing with your friends or your family, music to me is very important in that way because it does make space for that communal joy and healing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. This was such a lovely experience. So thank you so much for being here. I was curious, for info, what would you recommend as processes that inspire everybody to interested in publishing?
Yeah, I think for me, what got me like hooked into poetry was when I still remember this experience. I was like 13 and I competed in this huge slam at the Library of Congress. And people like, it was this crazy moment where, you know, I was too young to be there. I was 12 and everyone else was like 13 through 19, mostly like 17, 18. And I had this poem about like Black Lives Matter, this Confederate flag that my friend had in like the western part of downtown Indianapolis. Like it felt like a very specific story to me. And, you know, my mom was telling me, like, I don't know if you should do this poem. It's kind of shaking the table. So I was nervous about it. And I get up there. This was my first, like, big slam that I traveled to compete at. And I saw how it connected with so many people. So I think if you make space for this communal practice of, like, writing and sharing poems, that's one thing that, for me, showed me the power of poetry. And then also watching and reading, you know, reading other poets, I think that always like makes you a better artist, but watching like slam teams compete, seeing people like dance in their poems or move in their poems or like do a poem together with 4 people on the stage, that for me was super powerful as a young person, and seeing the ways that this art form can evolve and can grow and can be so visually interesting and adaptable for like the world in which I live, like the world I grew up knowing. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's complicated it in the sense that I'm a lot more intentional all the time when I'm writing. I think, you know, when I first started writing, I was really young, and so I would write things that I was interested in, or I would write for fun, or when I got home, like, I wanted to write a poem, I wanted to read a poem, or I'd prepare for a competition. Now I'm thinking about, like, and also, like, as I got better as a poet, I was thinking about what are the implications of the topic I'm writing about? Like if I write about the color black, or if I write about this football game, or these boys that I know that got into a fight, like what are the other factors that are at play there? Like what does it mean not only that these boys got into a fight at this football game, but also that this football game was in Lawrence Township on the east side of Indianapolis, and I was there with my dad and my brother. You know, like I started thinking about all these other factors that made me write about X event. And I think now, more than ever, I'm very intentional about that when I'm writing. And I also get like requests where people say, we need a poem about the climate for this event. And so then I have to think about what is my unique perspective to offer on that subject, and be very intentional about the way in which I use my voice to represent that perspective. Yeah.
Are the poetry spins like a crucial aspect to when you're getting the title U.S. Poet Laureate?
No, actually, it was something I liked to do. And so I competed in Brave New Voices since I was like 13, which is like the youngest you can be, up until it went virtual, and I did a year virtually competing. And it was just something for me that I loved. I loved the community of like going to a college campus with all these other young people, and there might be a cypher, or there would be the like MC Olympics, which is the rap portion of the slam. And so that was like something that was fun for me. And also Youth Poet Laureate is a lot of fun, but it's very different. It's not a slam. It's a lot about civic engagement and the process to become U.S. National Youth Poet Laureate. I had to compete at the local level first with other people in my community writing and doing the same things. And then I had to use that title to make change in my community, give workshops, and speak about issues that were important to me. And then I competed at the regional level, and you submit like written work. It's not like a slam, but they're looking at your civic engagement history and your written work. And then for the national title, it was about how we managed our regional engagement. It's about professionalism. It's about civic engagement and what's our platform. We had to write essays about our platform, how we would use our title, what we care about. We had to submit a portfolio of a lot of poems. There's like an interview type portion. It's very holistic. And so it's very different from a slam in the sense that it's not like me versus three other girls, like spitting our hardest poem, see who gets the highest score. But it's a lot about like serving your community. Okay, so thank you guys. I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you all for having me. It's been exciting.